worked at the Engelberg Center for Healthcare Reform at the Brookings Institution, where she managed initiatives related to healthcare quality and equity. Prior to joining Brookings, Ayadela worked as a senior associate for the Lewin Group, a healthcare research and consulting firm, and as project coordinator for a study on women's health at Georgetown University. Ayadela has over 15 years of experience developing and implementing initiatives, supporting and developing strategies for patient and stakeholder engagement, supporting patient-centered comparative effectiveness research, and advancing health and healthcare equity. Ayadela has a Bachelor of Arts in English Writing with minors in chemistry and biology from the University of Pittsburgh and an MHS from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. So welcome, Ayadela. Now for John's. So John R. Pamplin II is an assistant professor, faculty fellow, and a Smart Cities postdoctoral associate in the Center for Urban Science and Progress. He received both of his PhD and his MPH in epidemiology from the Columbia University Millman School of Public Health and a Bachelor of Science in Biology with honors from Morehouse College. Shout out to Spelman and Morehouse. John's research focuses on studying the mental health and substance use consequences of structural forms of racism. His past work aimed to understand the rationale behind racial patterning and psychopathology, with a particular focus on racial patterns in DSM-diagnosed major depression. John's current research focuses on the role played by varying policy structures, like policing and criminal justice policies, in driving mental health and substance use inequities in urban settings. Using machine learning and other methodological tools, John's work aims to evaluate the effectiveness of policy interventions in curbing the opioid epidemic, examine the roles of law enforcement decisions in producing the policy's downstream effects, and assesses the policy's potential to either alleviate or exacerbate racial health disparities. While at Columbia, John was a pre-doctoral fellow in the Department of Epidemiology's Psychiatric Epidemiology Training Program, funded by the National Institute of Mental Health, and was awarded the William Farr Award for commitment to addressing the causes of social inequalities in health and promise in the field of epidemiology. John is an active member of the Society for Epidemiologic Research, which is SER, and is the 2020 president-elect of the SER. Student and Postdoc Committee. Everyone, please join me in extending a warm virtual welcome to Deanna, Tanu, Ayadela, and John. So as a reminder, guests are encouraged to engage in the conversation via the Q&A feature. If you're on Zoom, there's a Q&A option at the bottom. And if you have any questions while we're doing our panel discussion, please put them there. And if you have cool comments, or if you agree with some of the sentiments that are being shared, you can do that in the chat box. They're different, but it would just help us, stay organized and making sure that we get to everyone's questions and comments. And Marie will be monitoring that Q&A from Zoom, and we will have Allie monitoring our YouTube page if you're tuning in via YouTube, and make sure that your questions are being answered. So this panel event is titled Race, Culture, and Researcher Identity, the Experiences of Researchers Advancing Health Equity. As Ariel mentioned previously, one of the unifying characteristics that brought us co-founders together in graduate school was that we were women of color with a burning passion for public health and service. Granted, we had totally different lived experiences. Without a doubt, our lived experiences shape who we are as people and how we navigate through spaces one way or another. So my first question for the panel is, how have any of your past experiences, professional or personal, shaped who you are as a researcher today? And we'll start with Deanna.
Great. Hi, everyone. Happy to break the ice here. So this is a great question. And as I was reflecting on it, I wanted to start with kind of my personal experiences. So growing up, my mother is Black and my dad is Eastern European Jewish. And growing up biracial, I learned early on this concept of intersectionality, even though I didn't know it already. And so I experienced being a part of a group that experiences oppression, right? But I also experienced privilege because I am lighter skinned, right? And colorism is super real. And because I had a white parent. And so I think seeing how I navigate the world as a person of color, but also have that privilege as well, I've experienced this duality throughout my life that I've been able to translate over to research. And so I'm aware and cognizant, right, as I move through the world of my privilege, both my privilege and oppression, and how that impacts the work that I'm doing. And as Ariel stated earlier, you know, reflexive methodology tells us that as public health researchers, we have to be cognizant of our gender, of our race, ethnicity, our identity, how we are both privileged and how also our respective identities affect the space that we enter. And so I think that my experiences being biracial growing up and also, you know, having these experiences have really helped me to always remember to have an intersectional lens when I'm going into communities. And then professionally, I think my experiences of going into communities and doing research under a PI, that's a principal investigator, sometimes the research that we were doing was not relevant to the community. We go in with a research question, a topic, and once we start talking to people, they're like, well, that's not really at the forefront of my mind. I'm concerned about housing. I'm concerned about safety. I'm not really concerned about whatever this is that you're coming in here to talk about. And so I think my early public health professional experiences have shaped me being aware that the community has to be at the forefront of research before the research question is even developed, all the way through to dissemination, implementation, and sustainability. So I think personally, intersectionality has kind of been at the forefront of my life and how I navigate spaces, but then also professionally, just putting communities at the forefront.
Mm-hmm. Great. I don't want to be a professor here and like cold call folks, but is there anyone that feels inclined following Deanna's response? Or else I can call on people, but.
I can go ahead and speak if that's all right.
Yeah, thanks, John.
And again, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here on this panel, and I'm really grateful to have the opportunity to chat with you all about what's certainly individual experiences for all of us, but yeah, probably a lot of similarities as well. So for me, I think back to an experience immediately after undergrad. You know, I first got involved with research in a kind of a broad sense. I was a biology major in college. I knew I wanted to do something about, you know, the health challenges that people of color and Black people in particular face. And so I decided I was going to get involved in research. And for those of you who've done undergraduate research, you know, you don't really get to pick what you want to research as an undergrad. You kind of get, you know, what's available to you. So I ended up doing circadian rhythms research, and I was doing a lot of animal models, and I ended up, you know, decent enough at it that it got me my first job out of college, and I had a chance to move to New York, and I was working at the psychology department in Columbia as a research, I guess, technician. And at the end of, I was on a 2-year contract. At the end of it, I decided that I didn't want to do circadian rhythms work. I wanted to get back to this original idea of trying to, you know, do research about health disparities. And I found public health. I applied to do a master's in public health. But one day I was coming out of the building and I ran into Dr. Carl Hart. So he's an associate professor in the psychology department at Columbia. And he asked me, he's like, so do you know what you're going to do next year? And I told him I was applying to, I was going to do an MPH, and he asked me why. And I had some answer that I think I felt was professional about the types of, and I couldn't tell you what it was I said, but he stopped me and he said, if you want to help Black people, you can just say that. You don't have to create some kind of acceptable answer. If you want to do research that actually helps Black people, just say that's what you want to do. Carl is incredibly blunt if you haven't figured it out. And I said, okay. And he stopped me. He said, no, I won't say it. And he said, I was like, I want to help Black people. He's like, all right, good luck. And he walked away. But it was a really kind of transformative experience.
I wasn't expecting you to say that like that.
And I mean, he meant that in all sincerity. I don't mean to imply otherwise. But you know, in terms of how that impacted how I approach my research now, I've had plenty of advisors and mentors since then who don't necessarily share Carl's opinions in that regard. But I've decided that's important for me to be explicit about why I'm here and what it is I'm trying to do. And I write my manuscripts the same way. I'm not going to beat around the bush of what exactly the point of this research is and why I'm here. And that was an experience that stuck with me.
That will stick with me also. Deanna, did I see you snap? Yeah. All right.
I was actually going to bring up my undergraduate school experience too, because there's something about not seeing kind of your community in the books when you're an undergrad, that you start to realize, you know, there's something missing here. And I went to San Francisco State University, and it's the first university in the nation with a College of Ethnic Studies. And by my junior year at San Francisco State, I started really learning about public health, public policy, how that shapes our societies, right? And how a lot of things that I thought were pure choice, for lack of better words, were really the result of policy. And so I think one thing that was clear to me was that what I learned before as a young person in the education system is not reality. And also that there's something missing in the things that we're taught. And I also realized that in order for San Francisco State University to keep their College of Ethnic Studies, they needed to protest. There was a protest in 1968 that shut down the school so that they could keep funding in the College of Ethnic Studies. So it's just proven to me that unless we advocate for ourselves and our communities, our voices are lost in all of this. And so then I decided at that point that whatever I was going to do in public health, I was going to make sure I was a voice and a channel for health equity, because if I didn't do it, who was going to do it, right? So for me, that was transformative, was learning about public policy and public health at such a young age and in a pivotal time in my life.
Awesome. Ayadollah?
Yes. Hi, everyone. Good evening. I just want to say thank you first for having me on this inaugural panel and this launch for Evidence and Equity. I'm so proud of you all. You all are amazing women. And I would say that, you know, my past experiences have shaped who I am in two ways. One has been around how I show up in the workplace and how I choose to promote other people of color, and in particularly women of color. For most of my life, I've operated under this notion that if I work hard, if I do a good job, if I work 150%, I know some people don't believe in 150%, but that if I do that, I'll be recognized, that I will be seen and valued in the workplace. And I came to the realization painfully that that actually isn't the case, that the intersection of my race and my gender actually means that in some instances, I pose a threat to people, that it's easy for people to want to overlook me, but that at the same time, they see me as dangerous. And if you ever thought you could be a ninja, right? Like both dangerous and invisible at the same time, that's what it felt like. And so when I realized that wasn't the case, I realized I actually had to shift the way that I think. You know, I felt like the workplace isn't where you play games, but in fact, you actually have to understand how to play the game. And even if you think that you're not playing, you're still in it. And if you can find ways to understand the game that's being played, you'll know when a baseball is going past you when you thought you were playing football. And so I think that's one of the things that has helped me to understand that I need to find ways to be a sponsor. I need to find ways to be a mentor. I need to find ways to make sure that staff have an understanding of what it means to have colleagueship. in the work that we do in order to make sure that we can advance health equity, but make sure that we have the people who are poised, who have an understanding of their strengths in order to move that work forward, especially when you are women and women of color. Quickly, the second thing that has really shaped my career is understanding that I'm a community member. We all belong to different aspects of community. If you are not currently a patient, you will be a patient at some point. If you are not currently a caregiver, you will be a caregiver at some point. And so the work that we do has to be driven by what patients, caregivers, what the community actually needs, and it needs to come from a place of their strength. So those are the two things that have just really shaped my career in terms of where I am now.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think to like follow up, Tanu, you may have mentioned how your experience within public health has shaped your identity. Or I know we've talked about that offline at some point, but I'd like to ask that question to all of the panelists. If there was any experience within public health that has shaped your identity now.
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit more. What I remember a few of our conversations, and I touched on it just now, which is that, you know, studying public health really gave me the tools to understand socioeconomic and environmental factors that not just contribute to my health, but my family's and my communities. And I think that, you know, understanding that helped me understand my place in this world, right? And that it wasn't entirely just accidental per se, right? There are things that happen. There were policies put in place that allowed my family to come here. For example, I'm an immigrant in this country, first generation. I'm proud of it. And I was able to do so, not just because of policy, not just because of some level of privilege, because we had the money to come here and we had the family to support us while we were here, but also because, you know, we are people looking for a better life in this country. And so I think when you're growing up and when you're trying to understand your identity, you think it's just you, but there's so many factors, and public health taught me what those factors were. And I'm, you know, I think I'm grateful for it, and I realized that I can influence those factors and make health more equitable in this world.
Yeah, I just wanted to piggyback off of that because that really resonates with me, because I think in the same way that public health gave me tools, it also gave me language to verbalize and communicate my experiences. I remember learning about hermeneutical injustice, like hearing that term, where your experiences are not well understood by others or even yourself because they're concepts that are not frequently shown in the media or in journalism or in academia. And I remember hearing that and being mind blown that there's a word for my experience, hearing testimonial injustice, like what? That you're ignored or disregarded because of your identity. And these concepts and this terminology that I can now use when I enter these spaces to talk about my experiences in a way that I couldn't before, or that I didn't know was a concept before. I just thought it was, like you said, Tanu, myself, right? Just experiencing this. But no, this is a global concept that exists. And not that the language made the experience, right? It's the other way around. But it gave me language so that I could navigate spaces and really speak to my identity in a way that, you know, translated to other environments.
Okay. Wow. Yeah. We talk about this often, us founders together. So it's awesome hearing you share it in this way. So as researchers that are women of color, us founders of Evidence and Equity often found ourselves in spaces where we were uniquely privileged, considering our educational backgrounds and our role as researchers in communities. So my question for the panelists is, how do you believe your presence does or does not alleviate misguidance or mistrust within research, whether you're in the conference room or in the community? I kind of want to call on Ayodele, because in our like pre-panel conversation, we were kind of getting into the thick of this answer. So I'd love to hear from you.
No, this is a great question. And this is something that I think I've been trying to understand as well and work through. I think that in particular in the conference room, if you will, that some of us come across as Malcolms in the world, and some of us come across as
Right.
what I mean by that is in the workplace, there are some of us who, want to kind of come in and, we're just much more vocal about what's wrong and how it needs to be changed and fixed. And, and that's for the Malcolms of the world. And for the Martins of the world, it is, more about trying to find the commonality and approach things from a more peaceful perspective. And I've had to understand, who I am and how I come across, and understand that regardless of the approach that's taken, that we can still have the same impact. And so I recognize that for myself in the conference room, I am a Martin. And, the way that I try to approach things is to build trust with my colleagues, to let them know that we can have open and honest conversations, and that my approach is going to be one of empathy. It's worked out well in that people can say something wrong, but I can correct them, and it comes from a loving place. But I appreciate the Malcolms of the world and have been able to partner with them to see change within organizations. Within the community, I believe that my approach and the sincerity that I approach them with, and really truly believing in community engagement, that's something that they see. I think they can spot right away if you're honest, if you're trustworthy, if you are approaching them just because you want something versus wanting to see, understand, leverage their strengths, and co-design with them. I think the community can see that. So that's, I think, how, in some ways, my presence hopefully advances trust and not mistrust.
Yeah, I think for me, it's important for me to wear my identity proudly, I think, in my work, both in terms of the decisions I make, but also recognizing that, I think of it to some extent as its own privilege in a weird space, in the sense that I am afforded to speak to communities that many of my colleagues can't, and I do have, it becomes an asset in terms of the fact that I can speak to them and they understand me and I understand them, and not because I studied how to do so, but because we are from the same community, right? Like, these are people that, especially in the work that I do, and now getting very heavily into kind of criminal legal system effects in terms of health, like, yeah, these are people who look like me who are largely getting wrapped up into the criminal legal system. It's my friends and family who have been. And I tell people this a lot, like, most of us who haven't had any kind of criminal legal system involvement had privileges and luck that afforded us not to have that involvement, because I challenge any one of you to tell me that you've literally never broken any of the law. And we won't get into that because it's recorded and incriminating folks. But so I hope to earn trust through my actions, both past and current, and being able to relate to the people who my research is trying to touch. And I think that's something that I hold very deeply with the work I do.
Mm-hmm.
To the question, Sky, if my presence alleviates or does not alleviate mistrust, it depends. And I think that's something that I have to recognize, right, when I go into spaces. Like, maybe this isn't the best space for me to enter. Like, some places are not for me, and that's okay. Just coming from, my background. Ayadela and I, we worked at PCORI together very closely. And Ayadela, I don't know if you remember, but I can't remember his name, but we brought in someone to speak who was a community-based researcher. He had done research in Baltimore. And he was talking about his experiences and saying that, he went out in the community and was conducting this research. And the community members asked, "Are you just another Black face from Hopkins?" And that resonated with me. I kept that with me throughout the years, because trust is a nuanced thing. It's not just sending someone from the same race into a community and saying they can do the job, right? It's showing that you're invested in that community. It's showing that, like Ayadela said, that you're sincere. It's showing that, you do understand, or maybe it requires you recognizing you don't fully understand. And so I think that we have to be cognizant of the nuances there when it comes to trust. It's not just matching people. Even with physician matching, that's not always effective, just matching physicians with patients based off of race. There's so many different nuances to someone's identity and their trust building with someone beyond that. And I wanted to share a quote I saw today related to trust, and I'll share it later when we move on to our other questions. But I think that we just have to be aware of those nuances, and we have to be cognizant of our own identities when going into communities, if it's most appropriate for us or not.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree, Deanna. And to your point, this idea that just because somebody is a researcher from an esteemed university doesn't mean they know what they're doing either. So this idea of identity and trust, right? I think that it's beyond, it's not just in the conference room and the classroom. There's many kind of spaces in which we really need to think about who is the expert in the room really, right? When we're talking about research, why do we assume it's the person with the job title that's the expert in the room? That is not necessarily or really ever the expert. And so I think, at least, what my charge is every conference room I enter, I make sure the expert can be in that room at that table when we determine, when we talk about communities, the expert should be there, not who they want, who is a self-proclaimed expert. That's not who we're talking about when we talk about expert. So that's my take on it. And in terms of community, I think we speak in jargon way too much. As public health researchers, epidemiologists, great, we know what statistics are, but can we communicate that to our loved ones? If they don't understand it, it's not because of anything other than we got information differently than they did. So why don't we try to communicate in a way that we can all understand? I mean, we saw what happened with the COVID epidemic, right? Pandemic, sorry, at this point. But when data was first released showing that a certain population was going to die at higher rates, mm-hmm. young people thought it was okay to go out and be on their spring break vibes or whatever. But it's because it was not properly communicated. We didn't know at the time, right? You can't just put a graph out there and say that's public education. It's not. So I think when it comes to trust and mistrust, there are valid reasons for it. And part of it is, how are we communicating and who are we talking to? We can't just talk to our own echo chambers of experts, right? We need to talk to communities.
Exactly. And, this, but as evidence and equity, one of our core values is being culturally humble, and just like this ever learning state that, you can't necessarily be culturally competent and like mastered something that's ongoing. So I think that us as founders, we've kind of realized that and made that a very integral part of our practice. But Tanu, what you shared actually goes perfectly into the next question that I want to ask the panel is, how can we combat misinformation that is pertinent to achieving health equity? You mentioned the COVID pandemic, and just, I think that we've all experienced just social media and all of the misinformation about vaccines, about communities, about mortality rates, and just all of these things are misunderstood. And for some, it's rightfully so, So I would love to hear y'all's thoughts.
Yeah, I can jump in. I wanted to share the quote now that I mentioned earlier. But the quote was, I don't know who said it, but it said, "We cannot force someone to hear a message they are not ready to receive, but we must never underestimate the power of planting a seed." And that sounds really lofty, and I know, but I have experienced this over and over again, especially when it's come to COVID misinformation over social media channels. I've been putting tidbits out on social media of just being a resource. And out of the blue, I will get people that come to me and say, I feel like you're one of the only people I can ask this question. I feel like you're one of the only people I could come to that I can talk to about this. And so being there as a resource, I think has helped people feel like they can trust me. But I just wanted to share about misinformation, that like, I think the method we go about trying to share with people information has to be really well thought out. Like Tanu said, I think that it's very easy. We hold a place of privilege where we have access to like being able to understand academic journal articles, being able to understand research, and clearly able to see a Facebook post and know that that's not true. But it can be frustrating where you see people spreading misinformation, and misinformation is harmful, right? It can get to people, it can cause people to make certain decisions. And so I think sometimes I've acted out of emotion in response to misinformation, because I am so passionate and because I do want correct information out there, and I'm so passionate about misinformation. But I think being mindful of the seeds that we plant with people, building those relationships, and trying to, be mindful about our methods of communication when we are confronting misinformation is super important.
Yeah, I just, to piggyback off that, I think it's also recognizing and validating why it's so easy to not trust certain channels, but trust others, right? Like, why is it easier to trust somebody's Facebook post that was shared by a loved one that could be just a conspiracy theory or whatever, versus seeing something on the news or hearing it from a different source, one that is actually could be credible, but the source that you find more credible could be your loved one who just shared a post. And so being real about the valid concerns of where the source of truth is that we're all believing and falling behind, and why there are concerns over whether they're true or not. I mean, it's important to validate that before we can move forward and address the mistrust and misinformation. And part of it is being honest about the unknowns. And I think we didn't do a good job of that this time around. And therefore, there's a lot of mistrust out there.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll just jump in here. I so completely agree with everything that Deanna and Tanu have said. And I think that when people look at medicine and science and research, they want definitive answers. So it's either yes or no. And the fact is that we don't treat science and evidence that way. It's, we can make assumptions, we can make assertions based off of the information that we have at this moment, but that's going to change over time. And we haven't told or communicated with the public about that process that we undergo. And so I think that's part of the reason why there's misinformation. But I think what both of you have really spoken to is this need to operate in the communities that you are already in, right? People are coming to you because you're already, known to them, and you have the ability to debunk or reinforce the truth. The other thing that I'll say is that I think we have to remember that people need stories and they need statistics. One of my favorite quotes is that statistics are patient stories with the tears wiped away. And sometimes, there are certain people that need the statistics, they need the hardcore data, and there are certain people who need the story. We need to be able to communicate with both of those groups of people, or people who need both.
Yeah, I'll add on to that. I agree with everything that has been said. And I think something that is really kind of strikes me is this idea of the family member or friend and the quote unquote reliable source being different people, and how for so many communities, that's not a thing, that those things aren't mutually exclusive. And so for so many, I've been, all of my group chats since March have been filled with, anytime someone has a question, they come and ask me, or when they see something, they're like, hey, is this valid or not? Is this true or not? Give us, what is this, right? Mm-hmm. And it makes me think, for so many people of color, so many Black people, they don't actually have a personal connection like that, because there aren't many of us who do this work. And so that's, when we're thinking of structural drivers and structural issues, part of the issue with mistrust, obviously, I mean, there's an incredibly long history of why the mistrust is so warranted, as Tanu said, but it's so much harder to gain that footing back because, the people of these communities, by and large, are not afforded the privilege to get this knowledge and gain the access, right? And so really increasing how, I think most of you, actually, I know in the case of the E&E crew, you all came from Mailman, so I imagine you all got at least the spiel about why we need public health professionals to be coming from these communities and not just taking people and throwing them out there, and whether or not we actually practice that is a whole nother thing. But the point is we need to, and that's would go a long way to addressing the mistrust in communication.
Great. I actually want to take a moment to look at this Q&A really quickly because there are a lot of questions about this question or what we've discussed. So one question that was like upvoted, how have you dealt with community mistrust, and does it ever impact you personally? And I'll repeat it one more time. How have you dealt with community mistrust, and does it ever impact you personally? I can start it off. Oh, sorry, John, you go.
Oh no, go for it.
No, recently, in my fieldwork experience at Mailman, working in Betances homes in the South Bronx, I worked with Deanna. We were doing some surveys, and we were looking at environmental exposures and asthma rates in the South Bronx, which is like the highest prevalence in the country. And I am not from New York. I was born in upstate New York, but I'm from Dallas, Texas. And here I was doing research in a community that was not necessarily mine, because I wasn't physically from the area. And I think with one experience, we were doing surveys. I was super excited, super eager, and I was just really excited. But we did a lot of like door-to-door knocking, and it did not go as planned. Knocked on the door, we'd have, doors slammed in our face, or like I guess it was just very clear that I wasn't from the Betances community. And it impacted me because it's like, I want to help, or I'm excited to do this work, but I wasn't being received fully. And so it did impact me personally, but at the end of the day, it did make me a better researcher, in that I had to like re-strategize and like, I guess honestly, like, kind of like debrief, like, Deanna, like, what just happened? Like, that's never happened before. A lot of my research I did in the laboratory or like from my computer, but this was like my first like community-based participatory research experience. And I was like, whoa, what happened? So, to answer that question, how have I dealt with community mistrust? I did a lot of what the panelists have spoken about, which is kind of like identifying your why and how and when, like, what am I doing? And has it ever impacted me personally? Yes, short answer. But John, what were you saying?
So I was just going to say, actually, I have a project that's starting up in the next month or so, excuse me, where we'll be doing interviews with people who use illicit opioids, which is a community that I don't belong to. And I have a lot of other similarities with certain folks who may be in that community. But at the end of the day, I have to understand where my limits are in terms of how much can I actually share experiences. And so one of the main things that we're doing in that study is we do have a community advisory board that we are putting together with shareholders, people with lived experience, people who their day-to-day work is with this community. And it's important with community advisory boards that when they're done well, it's not just a checkbox to say, oh, well, we ran it by the community advisory board, but it's actually being open to like, no, guide us, help us make these decisions. Because I think, it may have been Tanu who said before, but making sure the actual experts in the room actually have legitimate say. And so that's one of the things that we're doing because we're anticipating that, people may mistrust us. We are coming from this university that many of them may have had not so great experiences with in different different ways. Different, you know, university public safety officers are notorious when it comes to you know, people who may have substance issues in the area, and so that's the whole thing. But we're going to try to make sure that we have folks who can help guide us, because that is not where our expertise lies. And in terms of taking it personally, I won't take it personally, because I know that that mistrust is valid. It's for reasons. And at the end of the day, I am still an actor of the university. So I can't fully separate myself from that and pretend like I'm not part of that system.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else before I have another question on the topic of misinformation and mistrust within communities. If before.
I can jump in quickly, and I can
Yeah.
talk a little bit. We have a project where we are looking at measuring meaningful community engagement. So I think community engagement is it's a hot button topic. You know, organizations that are funders are requiring it. You know, you have policymakers who are trying to find ways to engage the community, but nobody yet understands how to measure it to see if it's actually making a difference. And so when I came into this project, it had already been about 6 months underway, and I realized they didn't have an advisory board. They didn't have community partners. This work was about community engagement. They had people who had experience working with community partners, but no one really reflecting the community. And so we created a 12-member community partner group to support our work. But part of it was being open and honest about the mistakes that we had made from the very beginning, to say we should have integrated you from the beginning, and we didn't. And so now we're trying to move forward. We hope that you understand. It was about compensating them, to say, we're not just trying to, take the input that you have and call it a day, but we really believe in your experience and expertise, so much so that we will compensate you for it. And then being able to show them how their contributions have advanced the project, and doing that consistently. So I think that there was some hesitation. We were going off of the goodwill of the people who nominated them to us. And so we needed to respect that and reflect that in our work. And so we're just cognizant of it and making sure that they are actively engaged in all aspects of the work, and co-designing, and from the development of the framework that we're using, to writing the report, from thinking about the materials that we're going to use to translate it, so that it's not just a report that sits on a shelf. But we've had to be very transparent along the way, and to say, here's what we've done wrong, and here's how we hope to make it better. Give us your expertise. Share your expertise with us in this process.
Great. We have about 10 minutes left for the structured panel, but I do see some really great questions in the Q&A. I think that we will get to those that have put questions in the Q&A. We're going to get to that in the next 10 minutes. So don't worry, we will answer your questions. So I think recently we were talking about communities being the experts, and how sometimes we come into communities and they view us as the experts. But what happens whenever we're having trouble viewing ourselves as the experts, and everyone, is looking to us, and what happens in those moments of maybe doubt? Do you have any advice to our participants who are battling imposter syndrome in new workspaces? I think we have some participants across the whole spectrum of research and level of research positions. So if you have any advice for battling imposter syndrome.
I feel like I'm jumping in again, but I was thinking about this a lot, and I wanted to backtrack a little bit to the causes of imposter syndrome and why I feel personally I've experienced it so frequently. And it's a common sentiment among, my friends and my peers. And I started thinking about it, and I thought about two things. One is that our society the message that it sends to us is, right, these things like you have to have a pitch that you give your company about yourself in under 1 minute. You have to have a resume that is 1 page. It can't be longer because no one's going to read beyond 1 page about you. And it actually perpetuates this narrative that no one's going to care about your story unless it's distilled into the most important points. And I think that that narrative, it affects your confidence in being able to take up space, talk about your experience, talk about your story. And then second, marginalized groups, if you're from a marginalized groups, I guarantee have had an experience of your experiences being brushed off, ignored, or disregarded. It didn't happen that way. You interpreted it wrong. And we're seeing this over and over with the cases of police brutality, where we're speaking out against racial injustice and talking about our own personal and collective experiences. And people are saying, no, it's not happening the way that you say. And that affects your self-esteem. It makes you second guess being vulnerable. It makes you second guess taking up space, sharing your story. And what I've had to realize is I'm not being disregarded. My story is not being disregarded because of who I am personally. It's being disregarded because my story is a disruption. My experience is a disruption to what narratives people have been made to believe about their country, about their organization, about their institution. And so someone acknowledging your story as a marginalized person, that means that they have to reject the narratives that they've been told, the falsehoods that they've made to believe about the perfection of whatever it is. And they have to acknowledge their privilege. They have to acknowledge that they've been complicit in your oppression or have actively contributed to it. And so with that, I just want to say that your voice disrupts, and that's what it's supposed to do. And so, take up the space. We've been made to feel small. We've been made to be told that we don't belong, but it's just to maintain what is now. It's to maintain the structure. It's to maintain the oppression. There's a reason why marginalized groups have been marginalized. And so I just want to say that. Also, I noticed in the Q&A, someone talked about feeling the pressure to speak for all people from your group, right? Mm-hmm. But I think we need to relieve that pressure off of ourselves. We represent ourselves. You're your own person, your values, your point of view. That's why you're there, to disrupt. So lean into that is my advice, and know that you deserve to take up the space that you're taking.
Okay, well, I'll add to that. I think that I agree with you, Deanna, and I also think my thoughts around imposter syndrome they've always been, if I don't do the work, someone else will. And am I comfortable with someone without my lived experience, without my commitment to health equity, without my passion for public health and socioeconomic factors and environmental factors affecting individuals? Am I comfortable with someone else doing this job? And the answer is almost always no. I would rather I'd rather myself, right? Even if sometimes it feels like I'm not the expert, I have to remind myself, who decided who the expert is, right? And just remind myself that I have it. I lived it. It's not just in the books, I lived it, right? So reminding ourselves of the value we bring every day.
And I would just add, feelings are just that, feelings. And sometimes we have to interrogate our feelings and question the way that we feel. Maya Angelou says, take a moment to heal from the lies that the world has told you, but you also have to take a moment to heal from the lies that you've told yourself. Because you have to keep in mind that you have done really amazing things. You've succeeded where nobody else has. And if you need to start listing down all of the things that make you beautiful, that make you wonderful, that make you amazing, then do that, because you have to be able to push that feeling to the side, because it's not accurate, it's not true, it's not right. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. I do that sometimes, look over my resume or publications, okay, hold on, wait a second. This is true, these are facts. So that is reassuring to hear. And I hopefully, it's helpful for someone else listening also. We have a little bit of time left for the structured Q&A. So the last question I'd love to ask John and Ayodele specifically, what challenges and or successes have you seen in the health equity research space thus far?
I will start with this one because it rings so pertinent to this space. So for those of us who are doing kind of the NIH funded academic research world game where it's constantly chasing funding and constantly trying to get your ideas published. There was a article that came out is maybe about a year ago or so where NIH did kind of an internal audit about who was getting funded and why. And it basically came out that one of the reasons why people of color have such lower funding rates than their white counterparts is because they do the type of research that frankly doesn't get funded as frequently. And essentially we're talking about equity research, these type of questions. And it was very, like, they were explicit, like, these are the types of studies that we don't fund as much. And these are also the types of studies that people of color tend to be more likely to engage in. And so, yeah, that was one of the reasons they tried to explain away why there's such a disparity in terms of funding. Insert the events of this summer, where suddenly everyone had a renewed charge and this new concern with equity and racial equity in particular. And NIH doing their part, they started releasing some announcements for funding specific to certain racial equity types of problems and questions. And me and some of my Black colleagues, we looked at these funding announcements that the deadline was within a month of when the funding announcement came out. And for those of you who've ever had any part of working on an R01 grant application, it takes months to put that together. Right. And the idea that NIH had the audacity to kind of like, here's a bone, here's a funding opportunity, but you got to have it in 3.5 weeks. And we talked about the toll that was going to take for all of the Black and brown researchers who were going to work 20-hour days trying to make that deadline. And frankly, still probably get passed over by a white academic who has a much larger existing funding stream and therefore a larger staff and larger team and who could put together the application in less time. So that's one of the biggest kind of challenges that I think is facing us now. There are structures upon the structures that continue to be inequitable. And it's, a number of times where even when folks think they are addressing the issue, they create a new one. And that's what happens when you don't have a full lens of equity when you're trying to make interventions. If you only have a partial thought, or if you think that's going to passively get addressed, you end up making the problem worse more times than not. And that's been a continued frustration for me, at least.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing that.
And I would add to that in terms of something that is probably both a challenge and a success. I think with what has happened with George Floyd's murder in the past 6 months, I have heard the word structural racism, institutional racism, white supremacy culture more times than I have in the 17 years that I've been doing work on advancing equity. And so a lot of organizations have the realization, but still don't know what to do with it. And so I think that that's a success, but it's also a challenge. And what ends up happening is that they start looking to people of color as, tell us what to do, be the savior. And I heard somebody say, you all have been around for, hundreds of years doing this. You can come up with some solutions too. Mm. And so I think that in particular, as organizations start to look internally, one of the realizations is, well, if we're doing health equity, externally, then we have to have an understanding that there's equity internally. Like we can't make the most impact externally if we're not. But again, that comes with some challenges and potential harms to the staff of color who are there. So I think it's a space that we'll have to, just really be cautious in, because we don't want this work to stop. We want to keep on challenging and being disruptive. But it is going to come at a little bit of a cost to us and others. But I think it's worth it.
Great, thank you. I agree. There's actually a question that someone, and that it's in time for the Q&A from the attendees, but there's, I think, a question about, oh, I thought it was something different. It's not really related. But I do have a question for you, Ayodele, from the chat, from the participants. What are some of the rules of the game that have helped you advance in your career?
Oh, absolutely. One that I would say is understand your values. I think that we come into the workplace and we have a whole host of values. But I'll tell you that there was one point where I thought, these are my values. I'm not gonna compromise them, and I hold true to that. But the second thing that I would say is understand who you work with, right? Understand their biases, understand how they show up, and those two are related, because I remember thinking, I have a supervisor who likes people to blow sunshine up his skirt, and I don't do that. Like, that's not my value. But I had to understand that what my value is about getting the work done and moving it forward. And so if I need to compliment him and say, oh my gosh, you did a really good presentation, that's part of the game. And I'm willing to do that because ultimately it's about getting the work done and being able to make progress in that area. The other, element that I would highlight is, we often gravitate towards people who look like us or who have similarities to us to be mentors and sponsors. And I wholeheartedly support that. When I take a look at all of the people who are my tribe, who are like in my corner, a lot of them are women and women of color. But I did an exercise where, I took, probably about 9 or 10 different characteristics from race, ethnicity, education, gender identity, religion, and I started to map out my top 6 mentors, and most of them were women of color. And when we work in an environment where there are white men who are in leadership positions, we need to make sure that we have white men who are our mentors, right? Who can help us to navigate some of the spaces, because they're going to tell you and talk to you about how to operate and function within an environment where they have survived and thrived. So I think it's just about making sure you have balance. So those are just some of the things that I've learned along the way.
Thank you. The question that I was going to ask earlier, it actually does apply to what we were talking about before. I just asked you that question, Ayodele. But it's, do you ever feel too large of a sense of responsibility to push equity in your field that it paralyzes you? How do you manage it? Especially in fields where a POC is very much in the minority. I see many who don't want to be the sole representative of their group. So one more time, do you ever feel too large of a sense of responsibility to push equity in your field?
So I don't. But I say that with the caveat that is because that is my first goal anyways. And I think that's important because I have moments where I just stop and take stock for a second and be like, am I becoming the racial equity person? And like, if I get too many requests to review papers or asked to speak on and this, it's like, okay, but am I okay with that? And it honestly goes back to that comment from Carl Hart. Like, yeah, I'm owning that. That's why I'm here, and I'm okay with that. And so for me, it's the reverse. I have to kind of consciously, I guess, when there's that pull to say maybe I need to tone it down, I remember like, no, that's why I'm here. And it's understanding what motivates me to do the work, because this work is hard, it's challenging. It's if you don't take time to kind of re-ground yourself of why it is that you're doing it, then so be it. But I will say, especially for other people of color researchers out there, like, you don't have to be defined by equity in your work. Like, we deserve to have, and I mean, we don't fully have it because we're always going to have some kind of, the communities we come from, like, we feel responsible. And I don't think that's a bad thing. Like, we should feel, I always feel responsible for trying to help those behind me, but at the same time, we deserve to pursue the questions that interest us. And if every study you do isn't centered on equity, that's fine. Now, you need to be mindful of equity in everything you do, but it doesn't have to be the tagline in the, like, if that's not the research you want to do, that's okay. And we deserve that freedom as well.
Well said. I agree. Would anyone else like to contribute to that question on if you ever feel too large of a sense of responsibility to push and promote equity in your field?
I'll chime in, and I'm with John. I don't feel that sense, and especially as I've transitioned in my role. So at one point, I was hired to actually look at engagement and health equity, and since my promotion, I know that can't be my primary focus, but it doesn't mean that I can't think about ways to infuse equity into all aspects of the work that we're doing, because it's relevant. And in fact, I'm using my privilege and my position to make sure that equity is a point, and that it will be called out in some way, and strategizing to find the way to do it that allows it to kind of be seamless, where nobody's going to question that it's in there. And also making sure that, like, I'm surrounded by colleagues who will always ask that question. It doesn't matter what their background is. Have we thought about equity? How is equity going to play a role in this? What are the unintended consequences? But it's creating that underpinning among, the entire team, so that we all have that responsibility for making sure that equity is in our work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and as folks that just started a company called Evidence and Equity, I feel like we should chime in a little bit. I think that I think personally, I don't think of health equity, and I know none of us do, as a earmark for achievement. I think of health equity as a endeavor that is never ending, because to be equitable, you must always be reassessing what it means to be equitable. It's a work in progress. And I think when you enter a field like public health, although the goal is always to, cure a disease, end a pandemic, but the goal is really to equitably improve the health of our communities. And that, to me, is an endeavor that I don't see as a deliverable by the time that I die. I need to see health equity in front of me. But I think that in everything I do, health equity is in my mind. And I don't see it as contributing to health equity by putting a thesis out there that is around health equity. It manifests in many different ways, right? You can do the work of trying to achieve health equity in many different ways. And when you think about it as we are a community working towards this endeavor, I don't think it feels too heavy, because I think we're in spaces like these where we have a shared goal here, and we're not in it alone, right? The more we talk about it, the more we have these opportunities to connect with one another. There's a network of us, and it's just going to continue to grow. So it's achievable, and it's an endeavor.
Thank you, Tanu. I had to mute myself too for a quick second. I don't know if people could hear sirens. We have a few questions about, I'm trying to see if I can combine some, because we only have about 10 minutes left. Here is one. So this is for everyone. What are some ways one can invest themselves in a community that they work but don't live in? What are some ways that one can invest themselves in a community that they work but don't live in?
I think one of the ways is, as John was talking about, and also Ayadela, about their work with community engagement and community advisory boards. One way to invest in communities that you're not a part of, I definitely think, is recognizing that even though you may not be a part of a community, you may have some tools that could support a community. And so the leaders of that community could take those tools and implement them as they see fit. So I think, understanding your place, as I was mentioning before, should I be a lead investigator on this study? Should I be a co-investigator on this study and maybe have someone from the community actually, partner with me? What is the structure of the research team? Who is going to be making the decisions here? And really being cognizant of that. And then also definitely engaging the community from the very beginning to the very end of it and having them lead. And then recognizing that although you are not the expert of that community, as a public health researcher, you do have tools that can be relevant across settings that you can then translate and support communities with.
I thought, okay. Thank you, Deanna. Sorry, I'm like multitasking right now. Did anyone else want to chime in on that? And the first thing I thought about was my experience in Betances. Deanna, just kind of doing that like self-assessment of why am I here?
Yeah, definitely. And it was so funny, like reflecting on that, because Sky nor myself were from the South Bronx, but our PI was, and she would knock on the doors. And people would open up, let her in. They would have her sit down on their couch, have some coffee. And it was so natural. And like, it really made you realize like, this does actually make such a huge difference. I know we talk about it, but seeing it in action, you really see that like, even though Sky and I might look like we're a part of the community because we're people of color, actually having the same culture and actually growing up there for our PI, that made all the difference when it came to the engagement piece.
Yeah, I'll say with that in mind, if you are going to work with a community that you are not, that you don't belong to, if that's going to be work that you do and there's going to be some kind of long-term longevity in that work, get acquainted, take the time, take the energy, and it is time and energy. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. It's not going to be something that happens quickly. It's an investment, but it will also make your work better. Like it will, you have to some extent, you take your lumps. It is kind of how I think of it. Like just like you did, Sky, of having those doors slammed in your face. But people will see your authenticity over time if it is there. And so, I'm not advocating for this now because of COVID, but, when it's safe again, frequent some of the local shops and buy things, like actually invest into those communities. And, get to, there's probably banging restaurants. I'm a huge fan of finding the hole in wall spots, and the people get to know you as you frequent those spaces. That's how you start to build yourself into a community, but it only works if you're there for the authentic reasons, because if you're not, like, they will see right through it. And if you're not, then you probably shouldn't be working with that community to start with.
All right, and the last question I think we'll take from the Q&A is, this is for everyone. What role or impact would you say implicit bias at both the societal and local healthcare provider level contribute to health disparities among marginalized groups? So what role or impact would you say that implicit bias has at the societal and local healthcare level local healthcare provider level? So like coming from your physician or your nurse. And how does that contribute to health disparities in marginalized groups?
I'm going to say something. I feel like we have given a lot of people a nice, like, get out of jail free card with implicit bias. And don't get me wrong, it's certainly there, it's certainly prevalent, and it certainly plays a role. But I think we give a lot of people cover to claim implicit bias when it was incredibly explicit. And so I think, for example, there's a lot of conversations right now around implicit bias in terms of pregnancy outcomes and maternal mortality among Black women. And I fully believe that some of those scenarios are implicit bias. It's showing stuff. But I also think that there are explicitly biased people who play these roles. And I think it's important to acknowledge that. We love to talk about implicit bias in policing all the time. And words matter. the word implicit means something. And so I think that at some point we'll hopefully push. I'm glad that we got to the implicit bias point, but I think we need to then move to, no, it's just racism or just sexism. Like just call it out, because it's also, yeah. Okay, I'm done.
No, it's great.
I really appreciate that, because there's so many euphemisms we use in public health alone and then broadly for white supremacy, racism. And I think like even at times, like social determinants of health to me has become like this like cliche word that doesn't hold a lot anymore, because it's like this cover all of like all these factors that stem from racism in large in part. So I really appreciate that statement. Words do absolutely matter.
Sorry, Ayodele, were you about to say something? No? Okay, sorry.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, and I guess the last question really I'll take from Q&A, it does say this discussion has been life-changing. When will you be hosting another Zoom event? That is a great question. And thank you so much to all of our panelists, John and Ayodele. It's been such a pleasure to have you here and engaging in this discussion. I have certainly learned a lot, and we really appreciate your support with E&E, and we will continue to support you both as well. Thank you so much. We are nearing up on time, but I wanted to pass this on to Ariel, who will do our closing. And for folks that are interested, we will get Ayodele and John's contact information, and I think we'll be able to send it out to our, if you registered like via the Zoom link, I think we can get it to you that way. But yeah, Ariel, are you nearby to do the closing?
Yes.
Oh, there you are.
Yes.
And John, Ayodele, Tanu, we can all turn off our videos now. Get a break.
Yes, that was a fantastic discussion. Thank you. I would like to thank our guests again, Ms. Ayodele Nishe and Dr. John Pamplin II, for joining our conversation. It was very enlightening and it was very moving. Working on the back end and doing all these things, it's definitely encouraging to know that there are people and there is a space for E&E to do the work that we are doing, and there's a need for it in our communities and in our society. So I thank you all. I thank you both for joining us. I would like to also thank the attendees for participating in our virtual launch event. It's very exciting. We're very eager and excited to get working. There are just a few things I would like to share with you. So I'm going to quickly share my screen with you all. So bear with me. So just in case I have any technical difficulties. Marie, can you allow me to share my screen, please?
All right, go ahead.
Thank you. Oh, snap. So you're viewing my screen. If interested, sorry, E&E is very excited and ready to collaborate with you. We would like to work with you and reach out. You can reach out to us via our contact us page, which is visible right here on our website. Or you can email us at info@evidenceandequity.com. We would love to work with you and look forward to hearing from you all. The process to working with us is actually, it's very simple. It's 4 steps. We would ask you to complete an interest form, and then we'll reach out and via email to schedule a time to discuss your project needs and fit in more detail. And once you decided to work with us, we will develop a comprehensive collaborative project plan with you that outlines all your project needs and a planned timeline. And then we'll start working. The form that we asked you to complete, the initial form is right here. We asked you to fill out your interest, your first and last name, email, and just a little bit more of what about your organization, your mission, and the project needs that you will be requiring from E&E. We also asked to subscribe to our website, which could be found below on all of our pages. And as a startup company, there are also some financial costs that are associated with achieving our mission of engaging with communities and promoting health equity. If able, please consider donating to Evidence and Equity at our website by using the little donate button on the top right-hand corner of our toolbar. You can donate and the link will be right there. We also ask that you follow us on our LinkedIn social media pages, our LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can also view some of our services that we offer, as well as the expertise that we follow, that we each have. And I will stop sharing my screen. I want to thank everybody again for attending our virtual launch event. We hope to hear from you soon. Have a good night. Thank you.